and welcome back to our last session of the day, which promises to be another great discussion. As Canada advances towards more coordinated and equitable access to comprehensive genomic profiling, industry partners play an important role in helping address long-standing barriers related to infrastructure, education, turnaround times, and system capacity. In this session, we will explore how thoughtful and transparent collaboration across public and private stakeholders can help to strengthen CGP readiness across provinces while supporting a patient-centered and evidence-informed approach to precision oncology. For this discussion, please welcome Dr. Georgia Balsevich, Senior Sector Innovation Manager at Genome, Alberta, and Conference Steering Committee member, who will be moderating the discussion. We also welcome Don Wood, who represents the caregiver perspective. Don was a caregiver to his spouse, who passed away from colorectal cancer, and he is also CRAN's Community and Patient Engagement Specialist. Welcome to our industry experts, Dr. Andre Galarno, Executive Director and Vice President of the Oncology Business Unit at Merck Canada, Tracy Taylor, Strategic Healthcare Partner at Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicines, and Mark Otway, Head of Diagnostics and Transforming Care Oncology at AstraZeneca Canada. We also welcome our health systems and policy experts, the Honourable John Wilkinson, former Ontario Minister of Research and Innovation, and Dr. Michael Mengel, North Sector Medical Director at Alberta Precision Laboratories. Georgia, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Cassandra. And yeah, welcome everyone to this panel session. I'm hoping it will be really insightful and we get to hear from a lot of experts and leaders in the area. So I think what's really become clear at this conference and really over the past several years is that precision oncology is no longer really an emerging concept, but it's a really important part of cancer care. And as our understanding of tumor biology continues to evolve, comprehensive genomic profiling, or CGP, has become really critical in identifying actionable alterations, informing clinical decisions, and connecting patients to appropriate clinical trials or emerging therapies. And so while I think that the evidence is quite clear, adoption of such genomic approaches has not been even across Canada and often lags the innovation. And so addressing these challenges is no longer really a technical question or conversation, but it's rather focused on implementation. So how do we ensure that patients can access the right tests at the right time? How do we build sustainable capacity within our health systems? And how can partnerships be structured in ways that are transparent, responsible, and really aligned with health system priorities? And so in this way, our session is really going to be focused on the role of industry and how industry can be an important partner advancing innovation in oncology, helping address some of these long-standing barriers that Cassandra already mentioned, such as infrastructure, education, turnaround times, and system capacities. So with that in mind, I think today we're really going to be focusing on how thoughtful and transparent a collaboration across public and private stakeholders can really help strengthen our system readiness in adopting comprehensive genomic profiling across Canada, so in different provinces, and continue to support patient-centered and evidence-informed approaches. So with this, the key objectives of this session are to examine the role of industry in advancing access to CGP across Canada's evolving precision oncology landscape, to identify opportunities for collaboration across industry, policy, clinical, and patient communities to support coordinated approaches to CGP, and to explore what responsible and sustainable partnerships really require in order to align innovation with health system priorities and patient needs. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the panel discussion, I actually want to open it up and start with the patient perspective from Don Wood, who will be sharing his experience as a caregiver during his wife's cancer journey, when I believe comprehensive genomic profiling was not routinely ordered. So Don, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, George and team. This has been an amazing day, and I've been very reflective because of where I came from as a caregiver and what I went through to where we sit today. So I'm a big fan of grounding conversation, and I'll give a little bit of history on where I came from and what I went through with my wife Sherry as to where we sit today. So in 2017, Sherry was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic colorectal cancer. Um, Shortly thereafterwards, after the shock of everything and chemotherapy starting 2 weeks after, I looked around and I was trying to analyze the system and what she was going through because we didn't have any experience in it. And I wanted to do the best as I could as being a new caregiver. And I tell people all the time, it's a job that nobody ever really wants, but when you're faced with it, you step into it and you do the best job you can. And I recognized early on that that was my job. So there was, I live in Calgary, Alberta. Alberta Health Services had a little panel sitting out in systemic therapy that said, if you're interested in volunteering and giving back, phone this number. So I did, because I was seeing things early on in her journey that I thought I could add value with and I thought I could support her treatment with. So, a quick piece of background. So, Sherry was always very focused on her treatment and her mental health and just getting better herself. She said, Don, you go deal with the doctors, you go deal with the care teams, you figure out all this medical stuff because I just want to try to focus on getting better. So, therein lied the beginning of our journey. So, I didn't know anything about things like clinical trials. I started giving back at Alberta Health Services, now Cancer Care Alberta, with their group. And one of the first groups I got put on was asked if I could sit on a steering committee for redoing the website for clinical trials for Alberta Health Services. So, not knowing anything about clinical trials, I volunteered, wanted to learn more. Quickly found out that our system at that time in the website was quite linear and outdated, and it wasn't at all patient and caregiver centric from a navigation standpoint. So I learned early on that there was value as a patient and caregiver to give back. And that's kind of where my journey as a volunteer began back then while Sherry was still going through her treatment. So in the first year, I ended up volunteering on roughly 20 different committees across the group, not only in patient groups and internally, but working on with medical teams as well, because I was sharing some of the things that I was hearing as she was going through her treatment and asking those kinds of questions as an outsider, not necessarily as a caregiver and a husband, but as an outsider saying, well, why do we do it this way? What about this? Have you thought about this? Why does the system operate like this? And I came from a business background, so I tried to put on that lens of taking the unbelievable emotional toll of it off my shoulders and thinking of it rationally as to what I could do to better help her treatment and her care and for other patients and caregivers that were going through it as well. So that's kind of where things started out. So Sherry's journey was 3 years. Like I said, I didn't know anything about colon cancer, but I did lose my brother to leukemia in the early 80s as a youngster, my only sibling. So I use the analogy all the time. I grew up with cancer, and my parents grew up with cancer. I never thought it would affect me again. I grew up thinking every time I had a cold that I had cancer because I didn't know any better, and I got through it as a young man. So working on all these support groups and seeing other things and working within the system really helped me. And one of the things that I look at today and how amazing this conference has been and the work that we're involved in and everyone here has been doing to support is, where would that have been if I'd have known more, or we had access to CGP and these other things back in the day? Thinking back, this was between 2017 and 2020. What different perspective would I have? What different access to treatments and to care patterns and to those 10-minute conversations I used to say when we sit with the oncology team about what was coming up next and where we'd been? How would that have changed? When I look back now, it's been 6 years. It's kind of a reflection point I don't really like to go to because I like to focus on the positive, on where research is going now. Precision oncology was something I've been fascinated in since she started her journey and, since passed in 2020, and something that has driven me to give back and do what I do now. So that's always been in the back of my mind. And, I look back at it and I was thinking today before this and listening to everybody else speak out through the day. So, everybody has a different experience and every experience is a difficult one, and there's highs and lows. Sherry's was 3 major surgeries, including a HIPEC surgery, 30 rounds of chemotherapy, FOLFOX, irinotecan, and panitumumab. But she had terrible allergic reactions from literally the first 5 minutes in her first chemo dose. So what sometimes was a 2.5 hour day turned out to be an 8 or 10 hour day in the hospital. So there was a lot of difficulties along the road, and we didn't get to have these conversations about, what other alternatives are out there. It was basically just, as I call it now, that traditional standard of care that was there. It was surgery, chemo, get through that, surgery, chemo, get through that, and then we'll reassess. So like I said a few minutes ago, it's tough for me to look back now and reflect on what would have been different or what could have been different. But I see all the positives today and all the incredible things that have happened. And, I say things used to happen in years in medicine, then it became months. Now I think it's days and hours with AI affecting everything. And we're hearing about that today. And I know we're going to hear about it a lot in our group today. But I just wanted to give that perspective on, 6, 7 years ago, it wasn't that long ago, but it feels like 25 years ago from where we've come to today. So the only other thing I'd like to add is, I came to CRAN in February. It's been an unbelievable experience because I wanted to give back, and I'm able to share my story and do it professionally. And then I'm also CRAN's caregiver coach. So I'm able to share what I've learned, and share my experience for others to hopefully make their journeys and expectations and patterns work better for them. So happy to be here and happy to contribute today. Thank you, Georgia.
Thanks, Don. That was really good to hear, and to hear the patient perspective and need to be patient-centered. Hearing about the barriers that you had to access and how can these be improved. So I think that sets the stage really well for our panel discussion, where we're really going to be going through a few sets of questions and have our different panel members address some of these. And I'm going to actually lead it with looking at kind of responsible and sustainable partnerships and how do we bring innovation into healthcare. And Michael, I want to start off with you as Medical Director of Alberta Precision Labs. Can you really comment on what is required to ensure that collaborations between health systems and industry are responsible, sustainable, and really aligned with those operational realities that exist in our systems, of course?
Yeah, thank you. I agree what Don said is over the last couple of years, the technologies for precision oncology became mainstream. So 10 years ago, next generation sequencing was just emerging, or molecular technologies, and the technology itself was still in the research and development stage. And that is a major game changer now that in Canada and most developed countries, most diagnostic laboratories have access to these technologies on a routine basis. So there is a problem of scalability and capacity, but not this technology leap which we were facing 10 years ago, where we didn't have qualified workforce or didn't have robust products, where a lot of capital investment was required to build a foundational infrastructure. I think that has been overcome. And now the partnership, back then partnerships around were formed around that. Now partnerships is more around the question to generate the appropriate evidence to make a decision that a new drug or associated diagnostic test or genetic profile becomes mainstream, not experimental anymore. And because experimental access is often inequitable, random, lucky you that you hear about a clinical trial or fit the inclusion criteria, right? So this is not saying you have this diagnosis, this is our care pathway. And my role is more, how do we get in a very timely fashion with little delay, emerging new therapy options into this standard of care, and which is often paired with diagnostic workup of cancer specimens or cancer patients surveillance or screening. So how do we generate quickly the appropriate evidence to make that decision that payers shall fund that in a sustainable manner? And the first question which comes to mind is, who pays for the evidence generation? And the second question which comes to mind, and I have ideas about the answer, but that's just my view, and I think the panel might have different views. The second main question is, who decides what level of evidence or degree of evidence is required to make a decision to have an adoption in a sustainable manner. Because some people say, oh, a pure association, or I have heard about this, or is good enough. And I'm not blaming any patients or patient groups, right? When you are in this situation, you are looking for the next option, as Don said, and that's natural, right? But who has the decision-making authority to decide this is the level of evidence or the degree of evidence we require to make system-wide decisions? That's my perspective I have to represent. And frequently, or currently in Canada, still we're very fragmented in that regard. Every hospital, every group, every health system has similar but different. And this today was a lot discussed about the recent CDA framework, which I think is a big step forward in that regard. And we in APL in Alberta are fully committed to that framework. We utilize that framework already for years through our lab formulary intake process. And I think that is where we can do way better. So coming to your original question with partnership with industry, I think diagnostics can learn a lot from drug trials. Diagnostic validation trials with clear endpoints where payers and regulators say when that endpoint is reached for that diagnostic test, we adopt. That de-risks the investment for industry because they know what the odds are, right? Are we reaching this? What power? What is our investment? What is our potential loss? This is how the drug approval process and review process and evidence generation works for many years. And the same framework to make it safe and transparent needs to apply, right? We need to manage biases, the conflicts with related procurement decisions, and so on, which is also all not new rocket science. And I think there is still the perception out that the diagnostic test in this context is a commodity. Lab will figure it out, right? It's just a blood draw to do your genomic profiling, right? Or it's just a little piece of tissue. But the complexity related to this and the adoption framework and the sustainability are coming closer and closer to what drug approval processes are historically, I would say. So that would be to me some, but I think we're in the right direction and have made great progress in these partnerships across Canada.
Thanks, Michael. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought and provided additional questions that, yeah, can definitely be addressed. I actually want to go to Mark and kind of put it from an industry perspective. And again, raise kind of what Michael said, where would partnerships benefit from having a very clear endpoint that can be reached for the diagnostic side? So Mark, yeah, from your industry perspective, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think a ton of alignment with what Dr. Mengel just spoke to, certainly from our experience on the industry side. I think, when I reflect on the initial question around what responsible and sustainable partnership really looks like, I think when we look at it internally, probably very consistent with probably everybody on this panel. And I think Don's story and Sherry's story really reflects why it's critical is sort of that patient centricity within the partnership, and that kind of really needs to be the core. And I think when we think about what true patient-centric partnerships are, it really is about, designing partnerships that build in lasting capability within the system, not just sort of a time-dependent ownership or a time dependency, for example, on industry to try to sort of bridge that. And so when we think about, is something patient-centered or not in a partnership, it really is it durable? Is it going to outlast a single product or a single biomarker or an initial or singular funding cycle? I think our kind of framework for what responsible partnership is really, I'd say to start within AstraZeneca, we've really been involved in biomarker-based partnerships with academic labs since over 15 years now, I would say, since we introduced an EGFR TKI that required EGFR mutation testing in around 2009, 2010. And when I think about what partnership looked like back then, it was really about, can we partner with labs to build infrastructure for a single drug, for a single biomarker, and really kind of only focused on our own portfolio. And I think historically that made a lot of sense, but I think what we've seen over time is, that responsibility and sustainability within the system is long far outpaced itself. And I think our lens now is really about, how do we anticipate what the future is of precision medicine and really start to think about things less in a companion diagnostic mindset and more in a profiling mindset. And so now when we get into these partnerships, we're looking at more holistic solutions. And I think this is where probably for us the crux of Dr. Mengel's question starts to come into place in terms of how do you really kind of measure that and say we got there? Because I think when we look at it, it's about that patient journey where a broader set of profiling for patients, true CGP. It's not just about one drug anymore, one biomarker. It's about, numerous clinical trial opportunities being opened up, numerous therapeutic options being opened up, and a number of different novel pathways all of a sudden sort of unfolding for the patient. And so when I reflect on, versus the 15-year example I gave now, kind of what we've been thinking about and what we've been doing as partnerships over the last even 3 to 4 years, it's been really about opening up options and helping partnerships that create broader CGP panels that go far beyond just our own sort of biomarkers of interest. Because I think from our perspective, that's really what future proofing looks like, is starting to build the evidence like Dr. Mengel talked about within a system prior to those sort of evidence assessments and funding decisions. I think that kind of goes right into sort of the sustainability piece as well, is really how do you start to think about using those partnerships to sort of generate the right degree of evidence, the demonstrate that kind of cost effectiveness that can start to transition and open up conversations around provincial funding and kind of start to move that sustainability beyond that initial investment from industry into something that's far more sustainable, far more permanent. And so I'll give an example of an initiative that's ongoing right now. It's a multi-company initiative that's called Bold, or Project Bold, and it's something that AstraZeneca sits at the table with Roche Pharmaceuticals and Roche Diagnostics and Lilly and Illumina and Thermo Fisher. And I think that's just one example of, I think, how true kind of sustainability kind of lends itself within the system is a multitude of companies getting together and doing this. And in that particular example, kind of the raison d'etre for the project is to look outwards. If you look out to 2030, what does true comprehensive genomic profiling look like for a patient diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, for example? And let's start to build that evidence now. So, in that case, we've partnered with a number of different patient advocacy groups, researchers, lab clinicians, oncologists. And right now we're working with 7 labs across 5 provinces to start to build the evidence to sort of generate the rationale for that public reimbursement. I think probably the question for this particular session around industry and system partnership kind of goes back to Dr. Mengel's question, is there's a lot of people around that table. Not sure if we have the true system decision makers around the table to be able to sort of justify or answer that question around, are we actually generating the right evidence to sort of facilitate those decisions? And so I think with the partnerships, that's where we can probably start to get better, is ensuring like, are all of the right people kind of sitting around that table. I think the last part, because you mentioned Georgia, like kind of the comments around operational realities, I think that's where we are very sensitive. I mean, we're sensitive to the facts that there's real constraints in the real world, that staffing and volume and competing priorities and budgets, they all become challenges in some of these partnerships. And so I think really thinking about a resilient health system being a ready health system is kind of how we're trying to, meet partners within the system kind of where they are, is how do we future proof? How do we think about readiness through a future lens and not just sort of reacting when there's new science, a new therapeutic target and that sort of thing, and trying to play catch up, which I think, sometimes we've certainly been in that situation, definitely in Canada. And I think that one gene at a time approach historically is a great example of why that's just not going to sort of click in the middle. So I think, how do we work together with an outward view and really ensure we're prepping and preparing for kind of what's coming versus the reacting. So, I think ultimately what it comes back to, like where I started with sort of with the notion of really patient centricity, is is really making sure that, that this conversation is an amazing start, because having all of the stakeholders around the table thinking about this is the best way that we're going to be able to achieve true patient centricity within these partnerships. I think without doing this well, it means Canadian patients ultimately aren't going to have the tests they need, aren't going to have the drug they need, and so there really is a human cost to getting this wrong. So I think this is an amazing start to sort of see where we can kind of meet with one another in the middle on partnership. So
Thanks, Mark. I think you again had a great answer, but still a lot of questions remaining. And I think in the last little bit here, what I might do is circle back around to all of you to say what is the most important actions we can take. Because I know Michael said he has an opinion, but he didn't give it. And I know, Mark, you kind of alluded to that as well. And so we'll have to think about how to work together. But what's clear is that it takes everyone on board to, I think, advance this. Dawn, I just want to come back to you quickly from the patient perspective. It's been brought up that it has to be patient-centric, but it's also been said that the science and the innovation is really moving so fast. We're not looking at single clinical trials. We're not looking at single biomarkers or single drugs now available, but a lot of emerging therapies. How is it to figure this out from a patient centric view, and what's needed to make that sure that's accessible and not overwhelming?
Yeah, I think, and I've heard it a lot today, is patients, families, and caregivers have become very educated the last several years because of how fast things are moving, and you've needed to. And in the last talk, we heard about, and I see it here in Alberta with patients that I work with, is they're getting their CT scans immediately, they're getting their blood work immediately, they're learning how to, I learned how to read it. I learned how to disconnect my wife's port and got trained in that because I saw that it was taking excess time to go to the hospital, and there were quality of life issues with that. So there's things happening so rapidly where I think patients and caregivers can be involved. I wrote down quickly in my notes, because I like making notes as we hear these things, is ensure patient organizations, the patients, caregivers, and family voice is always involved and engaged, and do it early and often. And I say that all the time, but I think the earlier patients can be engaged and we have these conversations like we're having today and we're having in this session, the more value we can add. And instead of getting too far down the line and we see deviations and we see things that are happening and developments that are coming, if we can have that voice at the table and that voice of patient organizations as groups together, I think it adds real value and substance to what we're trying to do. And we've heard a lot of those stories today, and I know we'll hear more tomorrow.
Thanks, Dawn. I think that bottom-up approach is becoming more and more real, and people understand that it's needed instead of this top-down approach that has been taken previously. I'm going to shift gears now, and I want to look at Indices' role in advancing access and readiness. And this will, of course, also pertain to, as we've heard, regional differences across provinces. And we'll have to address that, as industry obviously kind of works across jurisdictions where each province has its own health authority. So Tracy, I'm going to start with you. Drawing from your experience at Johnson & Johnson, what role should industry play in helping strengthen system readiness, access, and implementation of comprehensive genomic profiling across Canada within our cancer care landscape?
Thanks, Georgia. And thank you for the question. Happy to be part of the panel today. And I'll probably layer in some similar comments to what we've heard in the previous discussion as well. But I think, the first thing that we all have to acknowledge is that our health systems are severely constrained from budgetary constraints right now. And so there's definitely an opportunity and a role for industry within this space, really working along provinces and the health systems to build that foundational capacity that we need. And this really, starts with syncing, what the future pipelines look like and what the needs are within those pipelines with the government funding cycles. It's really about how do we ensure that the information is really getting out there early to set everybody up for success downstream with what the needs are with respect to testing. But then also working together to ideate on how do we support things like data integration and helping streamline testing pathways, and also enabling more consistent workflows across settings. These are all things that are challenges at regional levels, but obviously from a pan-Canadian lens, there are challenges there as well. From an access perspective, the opportunity is really about equity. The goal really needs to be a coordinated and equitable access system across the provinces and across the country. And I think we would probably all agree we're not quite there yet. Industry can help very much so by partnering on sustainable access models, aligning innovation with system priorities so that patients, regardless of geography, can benefit earlier in their care journey. I also think too that from an industry perspective, one of the things that I heard from a cancer program leader that I work with is that, from a partnering perspective, it's not necessarily just about dollars either when coming together and working with industry. It's about expertise, understanding that many of these companies are global in nature and they have expertise that spans the world that can be leaned on and brought together to support Canada in that realm as well. Industry should also be part of the broader stakeholder group. And I heard Mark talk a little bit about this, and I think Dr. Mengel did as well, looking really to advance what precision oncology in Canada should look like. I think that right now it's very fragmented across the regions and across the country, and there's really an opportunity moving forward for transparent cross-sector partnerships to navigate those operational realities of the system. So that really means that the people at the table, it's the clinicians, the policymakers, obviously the patient groups, and industry to ensure that solutions are practical to implement, but then also can be sustainable over time. So really, I see the role as helping from an industry perspective, is helping to bridge that gap within the jurisdictions and across the country. Our policymakers and our funders and our health systems, they require this, but to capitalize on the opportunity, there's a need to develop system-level partnerships that will enable that coordinated and patient-centered and sustainable adoption of precision oncology. And I think this is really, to Mark's point, there are many industry groups that exist across the country in different realms, whether it's precision oncology or health system readiness or areas like that. And I think what's unique about that is that these industry partners, they're not showing up talking about their particular therapy or even necessarily their therapeutic area. They're looking at what are the system barriers that exist right now? How do we as industry lean in and support making the Canadian healthcare system better through system transformation? So I think that's where I see the opportunity.
Thanks, Tracy. And yeah, really happy to hear that industry is interested in looking at those system barriers. John, I'd love to hear from you and your perspective within kind of Ontario's health system planning lens. Tracy made a lot of, I think, really good points. How does this work with your health authority kind of cap on?
Well, what I tell people is that there's a missing perspective that you have to find success. And we're fortunate to achieve that in Ontario recently when the government adopted a life sciences strategy, something that the industry and the scientists and the patients had wanted for years and years and years. So what was able to unlock that? It was understanding what the government needed, the government of the day. And it's pretty simple. Whether you go to City Hall or you go to the legislature or whether you go to Parliament Hill, there's two lines. There's a long line and there's a short line. Now, the long line are people with problems. And their solution is to get into the government and say, I've got a problem, I need you to look after it. But there's a short line. And that short line is made up with people not with problems, but with solutions. And governments, which are awash with problems, don't have enough solutions. So if you're in a solutions line, you get seen first. So the question is, can you try to determine what is the problem that the government has? And can you be part of the solution? Well, all governments in Canada and around the world have a big problem. We've got all of these baby boomers, right? And they're all showing up at the same time. And the cost curves are crazy. What government is trying to do is to look after people and trying to figure out how to do it with the most efficacious way to do it. And as a result, government has created stage gates and a whole bunch of barriers, because they know if they just leave it up to guys like me who are in politics, they would say yes to everything, right? And the province or the government would be bankrupt. And so that's why we have to look at it from a policy point of view. What do we need to do to be a solution? And so when others were talking about what it is they need to see, if you adopt that lens, you're able to determine what is the endpoint that you want to make. So you can make the case that, hey, government, you know, you have this problem. Here's part of the solution. Here is a better way to do what you're doing right now. Here's new technology, right? Here's new pathways that will cost you money here, but it'll save you a whole bunch of money over there. There is nothing more attractive to government. So they say, don't tell us how you need us to spend $1 million to save $10,000. Show us how we can spend $10,000 and save $1 million. And in doing so, will provide much better care for patients, because there's only so much money to go around. So we have to get the best bang for the buck. And once we think about it that way, I think in Ontario, that has really helped unlock the ability to get industry and our research community together with government, having a comprehensive strategy, all rowing in the same direction.
Awesome. Yeah. So again, obviously it all comes back to funding and pricing, right? And it has to be cost effective, which obviously Philomena's smiling there because of the report that they released showing that CGP was in fact cost effective for healthcare systems. So yeah, I mean, I'm a funder at Genome Alberta, and I know we really support economic studies to show not just that it's the patient outcomes are positive, but it's also savings for the health systems, because otherwise it cannot be adopted. I'm going to move on for the sake of time to our third question, which is really looking at areas where there's greatest opportunity for these cross-sector collaborations. And so I'm actually going to continue on with you, John. Where do you see the greatest opportunities for stronger collaboration across industry, health systems, clinicians, policymakers, and patient communities to support more coordinated and equitable approaches to CGP across Canada?
Well, it's always the cases with the strongest econometric case. Those are the ones that you've got the solution, and of all the solutions, you've got the best solution. Governments will always go to that first. And so again, it's that data. But what we want is we want people to actually look at the data and try to determine what's best for the most people. And I can tell you the way the government is seeing it now, usually the civil servants who are looking at that will just look at it and say, oh my God, this is even more cost. So they're trying to figure out ways to slow this down, but they can't slow it down, right? Because technology is advancing. But they look at it as just more and more cost. They'll immediately say, my God, if we could actually catch colorectal cancer 4 years earlier, right? And we were able to do a test for everybody, they would look at it and say, my God, it would swamp the system. We don't have enough chemo units. We don't have enough surgeons. We don't have enough hospital beds. So they look at it that way. Instead, you can actually make the case that says, no. If we catch it early, we don't have to do all of these things, right? We can treat people, they'll get better care, and we won't have all of the economic and health costs involved of looking after people who are diagnosed much later in their cancer journey. But again, there's a fear there, and understanding their perspective allows you to unlock solutions that governments, when they look at it, if you make a strong economic case, they're going to fund it. They will spend $10,000 to save $1 million every time. They're just worried that they have to spend $1 million to save 10,000. That's what they're worried about. So it's how to change that narrative based on the data.
Thanks, John. Andre, I'm coming to you next. So again, where can we have these cross-sector collaborations, and how can industry really effectively work together? I mean, we heard about this cost effectiveness. So what can industry do, and where do you see the biggest opportunity? Oh, and you're muted.
Thank you, Georgia. Is it working now?
Perfect.
Very good, thank you. So, as I was listening to Dr. Mengel, I thought about a story, and I need to tell it. 20 years ago, I interviewed to enter into the industry. And one of the questions, it was for a medical scientific liaison, one of the questions that I got is, what's the future of oncology medicine? Now, obviously, I didn't get the right answer, but I got the job. And my boss said to me, I asked my boss after, and I said, so what was the answer? He said, it's personalized medicine. And that's exactly where we are right now. I was at ASCO 2 weeks ago, and clearly now the science is not the bottleneck. We are having all these personalized medicine that are coming through the pipeline of all our clinical research. And but is the system is ready? That's the question. Or will it be, right, ready? Because there's a tsunami of medication that will come to us that will be targeted therapy, personalized medicine. So, to quote Winston Churchill, we're at the end of the beginning, but it's just starting, right? So we need to be really ready to this. So how can we better collaborate together? I think the first part is really to have embedded in our clinical trials, CGP. That's the first step. And that will generate the evidence that we can gather, as Dr. Mengel provided before, to say that, yes, you can save money with using CGP because you have a bigger panel and you don't have to do that test, you don't have to do that test. And once we have that evidence, it will generate the economic argument out of it. The other way to collaborate is through co-developed medical education. Very important. It's not just about getting it out there. It's also making sure that everyone understands, and specifically caregivers like Dawn or patients that can understand what does it mean for me to have access to this type of information. And patient association with this is very, very important. The next one, or the two next one, is policy and funding, right? I wrote down like a pan-Canadian multi-stakeholder coalition. So getting together to set up what are the standards. And once a standard is set up in one province, it will lead to another setting up the standard in another province. And that can, if it's pan-Canadian, then that standard is set up across the country, and it is providing access to patients. I think the honest reality is that one stakeholder cannot do it all, right? We, as a pharma industry, we cannot legislate or regulate. And governments, they can't innovate at the pace that we are providing right now in terms of targeted therapies. So I think the lesson for me from a collaboration point of view, it's really to sit down, and we're all part of the ecosystem. And once this ecosystem really puts the patient at the center, that's when really the magic happens for informed decisions and equitable access across the country. And we just need to commit, and that's the part that is very important. Everyone has to commit to make sure that patients get access to this information to make the right decision for their treatment.
Thanks, Andre. And I love how you brought in the education piece to it, because I think precision oncology is actually rather forward, but still it's a piece that needs to be there. I know in other areas where we try and adopt genetic testing for diagnosis or for informed decision making, a lot of times they're not used because either of clinicians' literacy of genetics or patients' understanding. So that has to also come into play for sure. I also think you nicely rounded it out saying that one stakeholder cannot do it all. We got to do it together. And it really comes down to this evidence generation in order to support these tools. Michael, I want to bring it back to you more on an operational level. So we've heard about it needing to be cost effective through evidence generation and all of this. But how do we operationalize this? And I know sometimes where you might see cost effectiveness to the whole system, but maybe not to the labs. Do these things come into play when we're thinking of adoption of comprehensive genomic profiling?
No, unfortunately not, right? So even in Alberta, where we're one integrated health system, so to say, or under one government entity, we always make the case that lab saves you $1 million for $10,000. Otherwise, we would not even implement something. But we never see the million, unfortunately. And you could argue that's okay, right? We're all in the same boat. It's not lab against oncology. It's fine. But there is of course a practical threshold of saying we need to invest, recruit people, right? You need to build capacity, and there needs to be some investment into the diagnostic capacity. I totally agree with Andre. There is still so much redundancy and duplication and unhealthy competition in Canada of everybody doing the same thing slightly different, right? And that can be better through national coordination at the right level. One thing I would like to bring up, which we noticed recently in Alberta, having a measurable impact, and we do 100 million lab tests as an organization. So to make a dent in our utilization curve, it must be noticeable, is disinformation. Patients seeking lab testing misled by non-credible sources. And I think the partners here at this panel carry a responsibility to counter that, right? Because it is, especially when we are talking about patient-centric, as a patient, as Don said at the very beginning, you have to learn a lot of stuff. You can be very willing to learn. You can be very educated. You can be very resourceful. But how will you see the difference? Well, it's like all of us taking their car to a shop. Your life is at stake. If you can't trust that mechanic, you might die going on the highway, right? If they make major mistakes. So we see a significant trend towards, let's say, alternative use of diagnostic testing. Trends to say, when we say a test is normal, that alternative providers say, well, the reference ranges are not the right reference ranges. And I think that's a risk now, where we go away from what was earlier said as one drug, one companion diagnostic, one target mutation, which is really very linear, to comprehensive genomic profiling for risk stratification of first line to second line responder, third line responders, right? Monitoring, where you combine very complex AI algorithms to clean up deep sequencing numbers per patient, right? This is a high level of complexity where we are also lacking a very transparent framework of quality assurance and quality control. You can change one position in the code and you get a different threshold or a different interpretation of a multi-dimensional cancer profile. And depending on what your motivation is to do this, right, it could be very misleading to patients. So this is, I think, something where we are also not very good yet is I'm, as a doctor, claim I know what's good for it. And I can't claim as a pathologist that I know what's good for our patients, right? I'm probably in the weakest position to do this. But as I learned today from Don, is patients often know what's good for them. And I think we in the middle industry, with all our biases, the healthcare professionals, the laboratory professionals, the policymakers, with all our mandates and biases, need to not forget about our commitment to the truth, right? It's very easy to, or it gets easier these days to create misinformation with significant consequences in this field. And we see these trends around functional medicine, wellness medicine, which spills massively into the classical healthcare delivery with a significant cost to the system, because the boundaries are very gray. My concern is the more we have access to these technologies, the broader the gray space gets, at the disadvantage of those who need true care the most. So that is a emerging theme, I think, which we hadn't yet really considered in all these discussions I had participated in.
Thanks, Michael. You bring up another layer of complexity. And again, I think that complexity is challenging for patients to navigate, although I think we are all clear that it has to be patient-centered in all of our delivery. Obviously, we cannot figure out solutions, as John would say, in this panel sessions alone, but I think this conversation is important to have, and bringing stakeholders together like this is a step in the right direction. So just before we open it up to the audience, I want to provide the opportunity for each of our panelists to comment in one kind of lightning round session here. In one sentence, what is the single most important action Canada could take in the next 3 to 5 years, say, in order to advance equitable access to comprehensive genomic profilings and the like? So we're going to start with Andre, and we'll just do a quick roundtable, and we'll end it with you, Don, from the patient perspective.
Very good. On my side, I would say, think proactively on what's to come and create that sense of urgency, right? It's coming. There's a wave of medication. If we are proactive, then we will succeed in that when drugs will come to the market.
Awesome. Let's go to Tracy next.
So I think from my perspective, it's really about establishing interprovincial or pan-Canadian coordination. We've talked about, scalability or things happening on smaller scales. And there needs to be, an interprovincial or pan-Canadian integration for genomic profiling to eliminate the duplication that exists at these smaller scales. This will help ensure consistent, equitable access across the country for patients.
Thanks, Tracy. That's a great point. Mark.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna just build off of Tracy's point, because I think our fragmentation and regional nuance is the biggest challenge for patient equity we have. And so I think, when I think about pan-Canadian coordination and CGP, I really think about it from the perspective of, how do we build it with the lens of assessment, with the lens of lab implementation. And I think, like Dr. Mengel mentioned, a consistent view on measurable quality assurance as well. I mean, that's something that we've certainly been partnering with at almost a province by province by province basis, and it is very duplicative. I think doing that in a far more coordinated way is probably the best way to get to that proactivity and that efficiency.
Thanks, Mark. Over to you next, Michael.
Yeah, building on that is I think we need to put more stringency, and that's being proactive to how clinical trials are designed, between how genomic profiling is done in a certain context and what the actions are, whether it's prescribing a drug or choosing it. Currently, we did treatment trials or observational studies, and then we retro-engineered the diagnostic problem, right? Or we had a diagnostic ingenuity and then looked for indications to give a drug. They were disjointed. And I think bringing all the stakeholders together in the field of oncology, in designing the prospective trials for what is coming, confirming the evidence, but also generating the adoption framework data, right? So that you do not do this sequentially anymore. So it's about efficiency to expedite, because I agree with Andre. We all know what's coming, right? This is obvious. And it would be unfair to the patients, to John's point, to find ways to procrastinate, right? Although we know it will cost a lot, and we can only reduce the cost by being proactive and being smart in how we design the evidence generation.
Thanks, Michael. Over to you next, John.
Well, to me, it's all about collaboration. If you want to do something that's pan-Canadian, you need a pan-Canadian collaboration. When you present a solution to government, the first thing they look at after they look at the data is, well, okay, I know it's going to make you guys happy. Who's going to be unhappy? And if you want to be successful, you want to be able to answer all of that question. So in other words, you have a large group who have a common goal. They've all looked at what's their perspective, and they've come to a common advice to government that solves all of that question. You know, when you're a parent, you don't want to pick which one is your favorite child. You know, as a parent, you got to love them all. Well, the politicians and the civil servants, their job is to love everybody. So if you can come to, if when you show up with a collaborative approach and a collaborative solution, that is going to just ring all the bells in government as something that they can get behind.
Thank you. And it nicely kind of complements it's the theme of our panel session, right? So this is really great. We need a pan-Canadian collaboration to really build across provincial provinces, really. Okay, so with that, I'm actually going to open it up to the audience to hear what kind of questions they have after hearing what you've already said. And the first question is, what endpoints would be recommended for diagnostic trials? Who determines these, and how can patients be meaningfully engaged in this decision making? So I don't know who wants to start us off. Michael,
can.
you did start with the endpoint, so I'm going to point to you first.
So it is probably not the classical endpoint as you have in drug trials, right? Like survival or improved outcome. A very valuable endpoint for us in lab is a clear definition of context of use. And an endpoint for a new diagnostic could be in surveillance that you can measure response to treatment, right? Without doing more invasive biopsies or something, or earlier detection of relapse for a very cost-efficient test. So the design of a valuable endpoint for us with these precision oncology diagnostics is really testing the performance of the test in a very defined context of use. Because the legacy is, oh, there is a new test. It goes on the requisition for lab, and everybody who reads something about it orders the test, completely out of context. Where we're going with lab is saying is this test works and has value when you do it here. Right test, right time, right patient. And often that becomes an argument instead of a data-driven decision. So defining when you design a trial, clearly this context of use is the endpoint for us, because the drug survival endpoint will always supersede the diagnostic test, right? We will not say, oh, we're not doing the test when you live longer, right? That's not going to happen. But it is more about defining really what is the realistic value this test can contribute, because it's managing the expectation up front, because it's often happening and says, oh, we do it in breast and it works there, let's order it in every cancer, but it might not at all work in any other entity, right? So this is maybe it's, I don't know whether endpoint is the right term, because it gets confused with the classical outcomes in drug trials.
Thanks, Michael. Do you think that clear definition is really needed, and also the clear patient population it will work on, because otherwise effective tests may not actually be implemented? Is there anything else anyone wanted to add before the next question? All right, then I'm going to move on. Some have suggested that a coalition of pharmaceutical companies should fund comprehensive genomic profiling implementation across Canada based upon the percentage of their biomarker-driven portfolio within the oncology space. Is there appetite to this from the industry perspective, and what would be needed to move this forward? So I'm looking at one of my industry reps to answer this one.
Andre? I can start, Georgia.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, my first response to the question would be like, absolutely, there's appetite, because it's in some cases there's certainly evidence that it's being done or has been done to some degree. I think the reality is is as things get bigger and broader, the justification for more partners being in that mix it just becomes a lot easier to justify, certainly. I think what what is going to entice industry partners to get involved is really, again, a kind of a clear reciprocal understanding from system decision makers around sort of what's the end, like what exactly, kind of going back to the conversation we're having, is that evidence that's going to sort of justifiably say, okay, we have what we need to be able to sort of transition that responsibility from industry over into the system. And I think it's still that gray area that is probably going to give some cold feet to get into that kind of that collaborative situation. And I think if we can have some degree of meeting in the middle around exactly where that transition occurs from industry to system, or what sort of that kind of litmus test point is, I think that is really what's going to entice more partners to start to kind of get in there and kickstart it.
Thanks, Mark. Andre, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, on my side, I would just add, Mark was a very good answer. I think we're already doing it. It's just that we're doing it separately, right? I funded some pilots in for development of some biomarkers that are not even related to our medications. So the reality is that each company, and I know AstraZeneca is very strong into that space, and each company is doing it. It's just that we're not getting together to make it happen. So there might be an avenue to this, but I echo what Mark said. I mean, at the end, it has to go to the public side, and when it goes to the public side or to the government side, it's a much more complicated environment. That's what we need to make sure that is sustainable and it's working well.
Awesome. I think we are running short on time, so apologies I could not get to all of the audience questions. But I did want to say that I think what we heard is that we really need to work together in order to have responsible, sustained evidence generation to support adoption. And that really includes that cost effectiveness that, John, you've pointed out nicely. Dawn, I want to actually give you the last word to close this out as the patient perspective. So I'd love to hear what you think about the session and where we're going moving forward.
It'll be brief because I've agreed with everything that I've heard, and I wrote down several of the same notes. This is what I'm going to put on a t-shirt. Universally fund CGP as a standard of care for all metastatic cancer patients and their families. And that's what I'm going to leave it with, Georgia, because I think everything sums up to that. But from patient and caregiver lens, that's where we're trying to get to. So I can't thank everybody enough.
Thanks, Dawn. That was very nice and eloquently put. I'm going to leave it here. I know we are the last session of the day. Canada is playing Qatar shortly. So for those of you who are interested, we'll have time to catch the game. So thank you all for such a great session. And I look forward to tomorrow's more conversations to be had. So Cassandra, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Georgia. So we've heard in this panel and also quite a bit throughout the day that the science and the technology are no longer the bottleneck, but implementation is. And it will certainly take innovative and collaborative solutions to move this forward. And we're very pleased to have hosted our first industry and health system panel discussion today to really delve into this critical topic. Also in recognition, as I think Tracy said, that industry expertise is an important part of this multi-stakeholder discussion. So thank you very much to all of our experts who have contributed to this great discussion. I'll quickly say, John, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that CRAN is very eager to get into that kind of cost-effective, solution-driven short line with the evidence that we have produced through the CGP cost and benefit analysis. And certainly more discussion on that is to come.